Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Shazam. Shazam is the latest in the DC movies, or the DCEU, if we're still calling it that, and it is more in the kind of sillier, more fun tone that we've seen since Aquaman, which I quite like a lot more. And I think this continues that tone. It's not exactly the same thing as Aquaman, because Aquaman was silly and ridiculous and fun. I guess this is less ridiculous and just silly and fun. And I guess slightly more family-centric in a way, but not entirely. It is a really enjoyable, poppy, kind of popcorn, blockbuster type of movie that we don't really get all the time, but I've noticed Hollywood's being a lot more better at precision making family-friendly, kind of big audience movies. Our recent unexpected one was the Jumanji sequel, which I did not think I would ever like in a million years and really loved. I only saw it once, but I had a great time the time I saw it. I was kind of taken aback by how good of a time I had. And Shazam, I thought would be similar to that, and it certainly was. I think the one thing with this newer tone of DC films is that they're lighter, they're more fun to watch with an audience than the previous ones, but at the same time they do feel like they're just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. And in some ways I sort of like that, as Marvel is so stuck to a certain structure, and that was actually one of my problems with the other Captain Marvel movie. Hey, I'm a critic, I brought that up, with Brie Larson, in that I felt like if that had removed itself from the Marvel structure, it could have done more. It's almost like it's going in a different theory that I like, but I don't like, I guess, how they did it, is the idea that this is very much a different directed film than Aquaman and all the other DC films, and they seem to, Warner Brothers at least likes to pretend that they're more auteur focus, I guess, and that's always been their reputation. Stanley Kubrick was signed to them. This one is more under the guise of David F. Sandberg, previously directed Lights Out and Annabelle Creation, maybe, one of the Annabelles. I have never seen this stuff before, but you can definitely tell it's kind of done by a horror director kind of coming in out of his element. He does a good job with it, but it does often feel a little messy. There's an intro that I don't think really the movie needs when you really think about it, with the villain. There's a thing with the villain Savannah at the beginning that I don't think really needs to be in there and doesn't necessarily help the movie. I agree that this film has a lot of tone issues, and that seems to be the main criticism I heard before I saw this. And at first, the overall feeling when you're watching the film, I didn't feel it, but then when I'm thinking back on things, I'm like, oh, that didn't work, and so forth. But I think one of the bigger things with this film that I found interesting was when I'm watching the film, and I know it's done by a horror director before I saw it, but when you have Savannah and the 7 deadly sins, who are like just these monsters, basically. There's this one boardroom scene, which seems to be the most controversial scene or whatever, where they're just like attacking people and throwing people out of a high rise, and this is supposed to be the fun movie where a kid's a superhero and stuff, and like, what the hell is going on? I think it's not only that scene is scary and needlessly violent for a film that's maybe PG-13, but it's also the special effects in it sort of remind me of the monsters, those dog things in Ghostbusters, like the Ghostbusters we all can agree on, I guess. That feels more tactile, that feels more real, and that feels more terrifying. When we as an audience are so used to this CG kind of like remove, I think being hit with something that's more tactile is a little more shocking. Also, I think going back to Ghostbusters and the kind of beginning wave of blockbuster, these were people who had come from horror with Dante or Carpenter or even Spielberg coming from Jaws. These are people who were not built up to be family-friendly directors. And there was a kind of fun and looseness to those kind of films. And I think this film harkens back to that era, but more in a messy way, less in a, when they did it, I don't think they entirely understood what they were doing. I think they're like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if a kid's film like pushed it a little further like Disney used to do? I kind of look at the horror in this as he goes too far, because I think that's more of his wheelhouse. I feel like he really wants to sell the scariness of this villain. He doesn't want this to just be a toothless, family-friendly film, but that feels like so off what we're used to. I do think they handled and spent maybe too much time on the villain, and he's like too worried about that villain mattering, when I think like ultimately you come to this point with this film where you're like, is Savannah. You know, Mark Strong, one of his better villain performances, and he gives a lot of villain performances that are kind of boring. You kind of think he gave too much prominence to a villain that I think overall maybe doesn't matter as much to the scope of this franchise as Zachary Levi and Asher Angel do with the character of Shazam, or Captain Marvel, but he's just Shazam now, I guess. And that stuff is a lot of fun, I would say. I think that my main thing is that I think one thing that Tom Hanks in Big, and you know, it's unfair to compare this to Big's another one. As a parent, I guess, because the violence in this has been called into question a lot, would I show this to like a kid? And at first I was like, oh, this is like a kid's film, whatever. But I think if I was going to like age it out or something, or like find what age it would be appropriate, I would probably say like maybe mid to late elementary school. I would say earlier than that, you might be sort of pushing it. But you should know your kid's propensity for these things, and that's really up to you. But it was a little more shocking because I think we're not used to that as a modern audience. But Shazam himself, that character, both the actors who play Shazam do good performances and have charisma, and you like to watch them. However, they're not doing what Tom Hanks did in both Big and actually in Forrest Gump as well. If you know what he said, is he based those roles on the other actor, and same with like, you know, like Face Off or something. And for whatever reason, the director or them as actors chose not to kind of play each other. And now I get the thing with the character Shazam, and I don't know him so fully, completely well, is that there are certain times where that character doesn't act like a kid when he's Shazam, and that's I never understood that as a kid. I was like, why wouldn't he still be a kid? He's a kid though. That's stupid. So I like that part of the character I thought was good, but they should have been playing one another. Zachary Levi should have basically been playing the kid Asher Angel. He should have been playing that kind of a role, and it didn't feel like that. And I feel like had he been more brooding and stuff, it would have messed with the tone. So it felt like there was some like performance, like understanding how these people worked as performers with the overall tone of it. The more I think about this film and the mechanics of it, the more I'm like, yeah, there was a lot of more like construction-y, like kind of bare bones of the film, like things that aren't as maybe interesting but mean a lot nuance wise, that didn't go into the tone or didn't mesh with the tone, that I think maybe is its biggest problem, but it somehow managed to be enjoyable despite all those things. Like, I had a good time, I really did. I do think like it goes to places maybe we're not used to, and like there's a scene where he meets a character that's very emotional, which I thought maybe like went too far, although I thought the scene was done very well. It does actually feel messy, but while I was watching it, I had a really good time. I didn't necessarily actually feel like it was too long. I was like having a good enough time. I was sort of like fine with it. Maybe I just wanted like an enjoyable kind of guilty pleasure, I guess, even though I'm not feel really guilty about it. And I was happy for Shazam to kind of like whisk me away and all those things. And I like that DC's embracing their inner dorky DC, because that's like what audiences like right now. The age of being embarrassed by superheroes or needing them to be super serious, like it's over, like stop it. X-Men Dark Phoenix is like really the last gasp of it, I think, for a while, hopefully. And this kind of embraces the Marvel idea of like, hey, we're superheroes, whatever, it's a comic book, we're going to embrace what we are. And I think this did that very well to my limited understanding of the comic book, but I felt like I was like watching very much a big, colorful, poppy comic book movie, and that's what I wanted from Shazam. Overall, what Shazam's trying to do, it's very successful at. I think on the inner workings of it, it doesn't work as well, and I think I didn't have as much problem with that with Aquaman, because it was like, wow, you got this to work. There's certain movies, and I think Mary Poppins is like the height of like, how the hell did this even work? It shouldn't on paper and structure wise, and that's a masterpiece at that. But Shazam is not Mary Poppins, obviously. Take that, Shazam. Gets close, but I think if DC continues to make films where it's like, let's just throw a bunch of shit at the wall and see what sticks, that doesn't work as well. Like, that's not as much fun for an audience, because I think people like something curated and well-mannered and well-groomed, and like a preciseness to the Hollywood system and stuff. And when you're just like throwing everything and seeing what works, you can't get that to work with Shazam as well. I know people might feel that way with Spider-Verse, but Spider-Verse is very well organized and very well plotted out. It's a very intricate film. This didn't feel like that as much, but I like the direction they're on. They just need to come up with like a better way to structure these things and like contain them. And you know, like the Savannah thing, like I do think that plot line is like given too much screen time. And you know, I liked how Billy Batson interacted with the foster home and the group home stuff, I thought was really nice and speaks a lot to family and blended families, actually, which is much more common nowadays. As well as foster homes, which is obviously directly talking about. And there was a good performance by Jack Dylan Grazer, who was in It, apparently, maybe? I saw that once. Everyone was very good, and it was very fine kind of studio superhero movie, and one that like really wants general audiences to have fun with it, but it also, like, the director kind of seems to want to push it into kind of these weird elements, which normally I think I would like, but I do think overall it didn't work for like what the movie's doing completely. I think I let that go more in Aquaman because it was just going more towards ridiculous. And in this, it's like you're pushing it into places that I don't think it overall like necessarily needs to. And when we're talking about narrative, it just comes off a little messy. You know, I'm no expert on DC stuff and all that, but it just feels like, you know, you should make your narrative cleaner. I don't know how you would have done the Savannah thing or anything like that, but it just felt like setting up the kid and then his family, and then like in the 70s and like, you know, kind of killing everybody off 20 minutes later doesn't really make a lot of sense for us to go into that as a general audience. This is probably one of the better of the DC movies, I guess, and a better direction. And I think with Shazam, you know, if you're looking for like an 8-9-year-old who wants to see like a fun superhero movie, you'll have a good time with your kid. Like, you're gonna have a fun time at the movies, and you'll be like, didn't you have a good time at the movies, kid? And they say yeah, and you feel like a good parent, unless they're crying because they're having nightmares, but then I guess whatever. I don't know. Nightmares are a part of growing up, you know? Until you gotta wake up 3 times, then I guess it's like, whatever. This is just like, I had a good time at the movies with Shazam. It is a little weird to see a movie just push itself in these certain directions because you think the Hollywood machine is too well oiled to like allow this to happen. And part of me like enjoyed that, but also the critic in me and the person who understands story construction and film is like, yeah, but it was sort of a mess, you know. It wasn't a complete narrative. It wasn't working together. I don't know this director. Maybe that's his thing or whatever. But I could tell his horror elements bleeding through. He didn't make like the total transition. His auteur horror aesthetic kind of bleeding through into this. As a older film critic person, I was fine with, but I agree, like when you're walking into this, I was surprised by that, and I don't think it worked for the overall tone. This film did actually very much have tone issues that I think holding this back from being, you know, this, I think this premise and what you could do with Shazam, and obviously thinking of Big and things like that, this could have been a superior, like amazing, fantastical kind of a movie that we're talking about in 20 years. It could have been better than Wonder Woman and Aquaman and all that stuff, but instead I think it's just like a fun, decent enough good time. It just needed to spend a little more time understanding and fine-tuning the overall film of it, and not thinking about all these various elements and getting very simple parts of this film to really land that I don't think really worked and was really worth betting the whole movie against to do. This aesthetic of DC's that they're doing right now is interesting, but I think overall this makes me look at the entire kind of franchise or label or whatever and hope they kind of refine it to a place where they can really kind of like make a really sensational, blow it out of the box kind of a movie, because it feels like DC is almost there and the audience really wants them to get there. This is just kind of another stepping stone, but it's at least a stepping stone in a fun, nice direction. So if you have seen Shazam and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.